Conservatives push a narrative that the disproportionate mass incarceration of black people is justified because of the crime committed in black communities. It's not uncommon to hear that black people commit more crimes than white people from conservative outlets. They blame a culture of violence within the black community. They also claim that black men don't want to work, that black women are welfare queens. They say that there is no such thing as institutionalized racism and that it's all the black community's fault. I want to talk about why black people are incarcerated at a higher rate and why black people are much more likely to live in poverty. To explain why this is happening, we've got to go back. We've got to talk about black history in the U.S. and how we've gotten to where we are today. The U.S. had 245 years of slavery where black people were treated as property under the law. Then there was 100 years of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws began in the 1880s and legalized segregation. The Supreme Court ruling in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that separate facilities for whites and blacks were constitutional and encouraged the passing of discriminatory laws that wiped out the gains made by blacks during Reconstruction. It wasn't until after fighting for civil rights in the 1950s and eventually passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that the legal sanctions of Jim Crow were ended. While the Fair Housing Act of 1968 ended redlining on paper, there is still a form of redlining going on today. Banks have targeted the same black communities for predatory lending or new tactics like retail redlining. Banks disproportionately denied qualified loan applicants in predominantly minority communities in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis. It's only been 48 years since Jim Crow laws were abolished. Only 48 years. The effect of that system are still being felt today. For instance, white people have a net worth that is 10 times greater than that of black people, according to Pew Research. Inheritance has a lot to do with that. Wealth is passed down from generation to generation, and black people obviously had a much later start acquiring wealth. 35% of blacks live in poverty compared to 13% of whites. Unemployment in the black community has always been higher than white unemployment, most likely due to being less likely to be accepted into top-tier colleges, racism in hiring practices, i.e. a study found job applicants with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to be called for an interview than applicants with African-American sounding names. Higher arrest rates and higher rates of incarceration. 13% of Americans are black, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, and 64% are white, but black people make up 40% of the prison population and white people make up 39%. That's 450 people per 100,000 for white people and 2,306 people per 100,000 people for black people. Social science research has concluded time and time again that exposure to the criminal justice system has intergenerational negative effects on communities that experience disproportionate incarceration rates. Because black people are disproportionately incarcerated compared to white people, many have come to the conclusion that black people are just committing more crime. But there are a few factors that lead to the mass incarceration of black people. The Huffington Post did a piece on mass incarceration, and it talked about why black people are incarcerated at the same rate as white people, despite there being 5 times as many white people in the US. They talked about how black people are more likely to be arrested for the same crime a white person commits. This is because black areas are more heavily policed. In heavily policed areas, people committing crimes are caught more often. This can explain why even though black people and white people smoke weed at similar rates, black people are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for possession. Once arrested, black people are convicted more often than white people arrested for the same crime. Part of this could be racial bias from the judge or jury, but part of it is that they are less likely to be able to afford a reputable attorney. Black defendants represent about 35% of drug arrests, but 46% of those convicted of drug crimes are black. Then, once a black person is convicted, they are more likely to be sentenced to incarceration than a white person convicted of the same crime. Once someone is convicted of a crime, a judge will determine their punishment. This can be probation, community service, fines, or incarceration. One study in Illinois found that blacks were incarcerated for convicted felonies 51% of the time, while whites convicted of felonies were incarcerated 38% of the time. The Huffington Post says, Racial disparities at every stage of the criminal justice process build upon one another. So if 1,000 white people and 200 black people, a ratio of 5-to-1 to reflect the U.S. population, commit the same crime, here is what the eventual prison population could look like. 100 white people and 74 black people might be arrested. 50 white people and 48 black people might be convicted. 19 white people and 24 black people might be sentenced to prison. This example demonstrates that there are systemic differences in how blacks and whites are treated by the law. These differences, which are compounded in each successive phase of the criminal justice process, increase the percentage of black people incarcerated for committing a particular crime. In conclusion, Black Americans are more likely to live in poverty because they have only had 48 years of freedom from Jim Crow laws and therefore less time to acquire wealth. They still deal with racism when it comes to being accepted into top-tier colleges, racism in hiring practices, and mass incarceration. Black Americans are not more likely to be incarcerated because they are inherently more criminal than white people, but because their communities are heavily policed and low income. They deal with systemic racism within each phase of the criminal justice process. This is obviously a very simple analysis, and there are many more factors, such as the education system or a more in-depth analysis of the school-to-prison pipeline theory. There is also gentrification and the drug war, which was started specifically to target minorities and undesirables. I simply wanted to try to go over some of the factors that impact poverty and crime rates in the black community, as there is a narrative pushed by conservatives that claims that black Americans are lazy, entitled, and inherently criminal. And that's obviously not true. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe.